Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the 4-issue Dead by Daylight comic book series that was released over the past year, starring everyone's favourite Canadian vandals, the Legion. The Legion comic spent so long releasing, a lot of people I think just forgot it existed, especially with the gap between the 3rd and 4th books. The original intention was 2 to 3 months between issues, but the 4th issue was delayed by a further 3 months, pushing it back to March 6, 2024. The result of this is that a lot of folks didn't even realise the Legion comic was finished and out. But it's here now, and it's been long awaited, because the Legion has to have some of the messiest lore in Dead by Daylight. Lots of retcons and things that look like retcons but kind of aren't, and non-canon cosmetics that suggest things that the actual lore doesn't support at all sorts of crazy shit. And although behaviour is never confirmed or denied that this book is the definitive canon for the Legion, it's easily the most detailed storytelling Legion has ever received so far, and I'm inclined to believe it's about as canon as you can get in a game as volatile as this one. But before we get into the comic, it might be a good idea to do a quick recap on the Legion's base lore for anyone who doesn't know anything about the Legion before going into this, kinda like I do when I check out tome releases. The Legion are not one killer, but 4. Frank Morrison leading a gang of teenagers from the small town of Ormond, Alberta. Following him, we have Julie Kostenko, his girlfriend, and their friend Susie Lavoie, and Joey, we don't have a last name for him. And before they were taken by the entity, they terrorised the town, revelling in petty theft and vandalism. Frank was a kid in foster care, bounced from home to home where he never really fit in and consistently acted out, landing him in the home of a single dad in Ormond who cashed in Frank's welfare checks for drinks at the bar. Frank's dreary existence in Ormond was given new purpose when he met Julie, who introduced him to Joey and Susie, and thus began the Legion's reign of terror. Well, calling it a reign of terror might be giving too much credit, perhaps, especially when we've had killers who've massacred entire social classes of people, or tortured folks to death for decades working for the CIA. Moderate levels of teenage hooliganism don't really compare to that, I'm afraid. But things start to spice up a little bit when Joey is fired from his job at a convenience store, and the Legion decides to pay the store a visit for a little retribution. A store employee comes out to stop them and grabs Julie. Frank lashes out to save her and stabs the assailant, and that's when it all goes well and truly off the deep end. First, Joey backs Frank up, stabbing the employee when Frank tells him to. Then Julie hesitates before taking her turn. Susie has to be physically forced into shoving the knife in by Frank before they take the body to Mount Ormond Resort for burial. But while they're digging the hole, Frank notices something. Something moving inside a coiling dark fog. Frank leaves to investigate, and he doesn't come back even when the others finish digging. Julie leads the others on the path following his footsteps, and thus the entity claimed the Legion for its own. The Legion comic broadly follows this story, not entirely, as we will see later, but the general course of events can be tracked through the 4 books alongside Legion's base lore. Issue 1 covers Frank's arrival in Ormond and the 4 friends getting together for the first time. Issue 2 covers the relationship between Julie and Frank and the formation of the Legion that results from it. Issue 3 has Joey getting fired from his job and the attack on the store. And Issue 4 has the Legion's first kill and subsequent abduction by the entity. And each issue focuses on one member of the group more than the others. First Frank, then Julie, then Joey, and then wrapping up with Susie. So that's what we're going to do too. Cycle through each of the books one at a time, looking at what it tells us about the Legion and their relationships with each other through the lens of each book's focal character. Let's start then with Frank and Julie, and books 1 and 2. And I'm going to be doing these two together for a couple of reasons. They complement each other very well and construct a detailed picture of Frank and Julie's relationship when viewed together. And they have the most to do with the Legion's pre-existing base lore and tome, so we can easily compare and contrast the Legion we already have with the Legion the comic is presenting to us. Frank Morrison's story is probably the least focused of the 4 on their character subject, which makes sense for the first issue since it's the one meant to introduce everyone to the readers at once, not just one character. I don't have a problem with this. Between the base lore that focuses almost entirely on Frank, and the large role that he plays in Legion's tome story, we kinda don't need much more of Frank. We learn about Frank by how he interacts with the other Legion members that get introduced throughout the book, especially Julie, and the impact that he has on their lives by being the wildcard mixed into their humdrum Ormond lives. Frank's book is all about him making his mark on Ormond, physically and symbolically, and suffice to say he pulls it off. Not so much by himself, but by his influence on the other 3. The first time we get to see this is when he meets Julie outside the school. He talks about how the school system is all brainwashing and programming, and this has the desired result. He He makes Julie feel special. He makes a mark on her in a way that most folks in Ormond don't, and this secures him an invite to her party, where he meets the other soon-to-be Legion members. Remember, Julie's first interaction with him is to call him disgusting when he offers her a cigarette, and he turns that around into being anticipated arrival at her party, all by just telling her what she wants to hear. Yes, Julie, you're right, school does suck. Being a rebel is cool. If you keep me around to talk about it, I'll keep telling you to embrace that urge to lash out. There's no icebreaker for a young man in a new town better than telling someone what they want to hear, and it doesn't stop there. Climbing in through Julie's parents' window when a normal person would have just used a perfectly open front door. Bringing booze to share with Julie and her friends. Literally making his mark on Ormond by carving his name into a tree. Everything he does around the group, and especially around Julie, can be considered more or less an icebreaker that shakes up the stagnant little town. And this is before any actual vandalism or hooliganism ever takes place, before he's even made proper friends. Frank never changes at any point in this story. He's a force of nature that changes everything else around him just by being himself. His faux intellectual, edgy, rebellious self. But to fully understand what makes that interesting, we need to compare and contrast with Julie, the subject of the second issue. Because what makes Frank, Julie and the relationship tick doesn't become completely clear until Julie's book hits and we see the group really come together. Julie Kostenko's book focuses on the two main relationships she has, her early days romance with Frank and her long-term friendship with Susie, because they work together to construct an image of Julie that makes a lot of sense with what we already know about her and how she contrasts with Frank, and the easiest place to see that contrast is at the very start of her book. Each comic starts with a dream sequence that sets the tone for the character it's focusing on, and Frank's by itself isn't particularly interesting, which is why I didn't talk about it till now. Frank's dream involves him watching himself in a Legion mask with that distinctive neck tattoo that we know from Dead by Daylight, running a poor passerby down and brutally stabbing him. But Frank himself isn't doing it. He's standing there watching it happen in front of him. Frank of the Legion is stabbing this man to death, but Frank Morrison isn't that guy yet. He's just a spectator to the carnage. I'm talking about this now because of how Julie's dream differs from Frank's. While Frank is a spectator to the violence in his dream, Julie is an active participant in hers. She's chasing people down in her mask. We see it in the first person. And the make-out session that she has with Frank in her dream is intercut with the two enjoying a most bloody and brutal violence featured at any point in the comic. Frank's dream has him simultaneously committing acts of violence and brutality while being at the same time detached from it, like it's something that happens around him. Whereas Julie speaks to a more active and malicious desire to hurt people and enjoy the freedom of life that Frank offers without the consequences of hurting people. And that's what Julie's books, and her role in the other stories in the other books, pushes us towards with her. More than any of the other Legion members, Julie knows what she's doing, and might be more selfish, more callous, and depending on your interpretation, more evil than any of the other Legion members. A subtle but clear way that Julie's selfishness is displayed is in how she treats Susie when they're going to school in her car. Julie smokes in Susie's car, even though Susie herself doesn't smoke at all, and she does this knowing that Susie's parents are super strict with her, and this risks getting her into trouble. When Susie calls her out on it, Julie just says that she likes being the apple of her family's eyes. More or less, she just can't be bothered to find somewhere else to do it, and she's willing to risk Susie's well-being for that. This gets a lot worse when we get to Susie's book later, but it perfectly demonstrates Julie's callousness. The consequences of her behaviour don't matter to her if other people are the ones to deal with it, and that's the running theme of her involvement in the story of the Legion. This is behaviour carried over from her tome. Julie is the centre of the Legion's tome story that they got all the way back in Tome 3, which showcases her relationship with Frank in a lot more depth. In both Tome 3 and Julie's book, she pulls herself away from Susie and Joey to spend more time with Frank, and we get to see more of her motives. To put it simply, she's just bored as hell. The comic does a great job of establishing why Julie is drawn so quickly to somebody like Frank. She wants a life in Ormond that's more interesting than the drab nothingness the town offers, and a charming outsider telling her what she wants to hear, and offering an opportunity to walk on the wild side without consequence is perfect for her. I've always said that Julie is the motive force behind what the Legion is doing, and the comic puts this on display perfectly. Frank talks about how school is just programming and how they're the real free thinkers for recognising that, but Julie's the one who first has the group get off their asses and do something about it. She's the one who picks up the first paintbrush in book 1. She's the one who makes the mask at the end of book 2. Julie's always the one that drives the group to action, and since Susie and Joey are only around because she introduced them to Frank, at the end of the day, they're her friends. She's the real heart and soul of the Legion, and if one day she just got bored enough to get off her ass, she could have started the Legion without Frank being part of the picture at all. The comic makes it clear that Frank and Julie complete each other in a lot of ways. Frank gives Julie that spark of life. He wakes her up from the torpor that a town as suffocatingly lifeless as Ormond puts you in, and rouses her to action. She has friends, she has a good standing in her community, and she will do anything for a thrill, as long as she can avoid the consequences of her actions. Frank gives her freedom, and Julie gives him influence. And together, that's what makes the Legion the Legion. It's a fantastic fusion of what makes Frank and Julie's pre-existing lore work, and it's brought to life with some serious chemistry between Frank and Julie, who we never really got to appreciate before. Frank is described in his base lore as being the kind of guy who could light up a room, but we've never really had the chance to show it off before until now, especially with Julie providing the petrol. As we watch Frank's musings about programming and incarceration at school, it's really just a guff spouted by a teenager trying to sound smart, nevertheless rouse the group of thoroughly bored Ormond teens to life. It fits together. It shows us why they listen to him in the first place, and why they follow him into his life of vandalism and crime. In terms of communicating Frank's character and how Julie latched onto him so easily, Nadia Shammas absolutely nailed these two and their relationship. The fusion between DBD's pre-existing characters and these books' interpretations of them is absolutely seamless. Before we continue to book 3 though, I do want to point out that while the comics get the characters pretty much spot on, the same cannot be said for the storyline and the plot points, because books 1 and 2 diverge pretty heavily from DBD's explicit source material for the origins of the Legion. A lot of the events, like Julie's first meeting with Frank, and Julie's party where Frank meets Susie and Joey, are events that were already covered by Frank's base lore or Julie's tome, but they played out very differently in the comics. For example, Frank and Julie's first meeting takes place in a diner in Julie's tome, and the two get off to a very amicable beginning, with Julie drawing him and the two having a long and drawn-out conversation about Frank's philosophies. But in the comic, the tone is a little different. They start off on slightly pricklier terms, with Julie being a little put off by Frank's smoking habits, before he starts talking and she winds up warming up to him. It's a minor distinction, but one that I think makes Julie's interactions with Frank feel a little bit more natural, and shows us a little bit more about the kind of person Julie is. She's not just a vessel for Frank to talk at, but someone who's constantly evaluating Frank as soon as she sees him to decide whether he's worth talking to or not. But way bigger differences can be seen towards the ends of books 1 and 2. Frank's introduction to the group in Tome 3 is relatively low-key, mostly just him on his armchair philosopher grind set, and ends up with him getting closer to Julie while everyone else passes out. But in the comic, the group absconds into the forest together, on that very first night that Frank meets them, and they end up vandalising the school together. That's the whole group's bonding activity. And Tome 3 shows us that the Legion don't get their masks or start using the Legion name until the very night they arrive at Joey's store to wreck the place. But Book 2 ends with Julie making the first Legion masks, and by the start of Book 3, the Legion is a common name Joey and Frank use to refer to the group and its activities. The development of this group of friends into the Legion happens much faster and less last minute in the comic book, which does make sense. A comic book requires consistent pacing between issues to make the story feel tight, like you're not wasting time. And if they didn't become the Legion until the literal last minute like they did in the base lore, you spend a whole lot of time not with the Legion at all. In terms of the strict plot, I think I mostly prefer Shammas' writing in the comic book to DBD's original story path. But the sheer quantity of retcons needed to make Legion's story work in this format pile up on top of the existing retcons that Legion already had. It's a lasagna of aborted story arcs, and while the cheesy pasta crust at the top is undeniably delicious, the meat at the bottom is really starting to stink. At the end of Book 2, I was largely satisfied with the comic so far. It was recognisably still the story of Julie and Frank. And while the art was strange at times, the writing definitely kept me wanting to keep turning the page. If nothing else, just to see it through to the end. But at the end of Book 2, I had a nagging thought. Why couldn't this book have been about literally any other killer in the game? Legion's lore is up there with Trapper's for the most retconned and tweaked lore in DBD history. And the comic book offering up yet another sequence of events just adds another thread to the cat's cradle we've been untangling over the years. Give this to any other character, any character with a more concrete story, and I'll be more willing to accept the deviations from the canon. But at this point, I don't know what DBD does or does not consider canon with regards to the Legion, and it's just exhausting. But nevertheless, I stuck around, in part because I wanted to give a proper review to you guys, and in part because I wanted to see what books 3 and 4 were all about. Because those covered the two characters we didn't know so much about, Joey and Susie. And I'm very glad I did stick around. Book 3 stars Joey. The fact that normally I introduce characters by their full names, but Joey only gets the first name treatment because we don't know it, kind of says everything you need to know about how behaviour has treated Joey since the Legion's early days. Frank and Julie have taken the spotlight in terms of official material on 2 separate occasions. Frank got the base lore and Julie got the tome lore, and despite Susie not having official story stuff that the power couple got, she's become a massive fan favourite, and as such has received tons of cosmetics and other cool stuff, including getting her last name revealed in a charm. But Joey has had scraps, including the prestige outfits. Julie has 12 full cosmetic outfits, Frank has 11, and Susie has had 10. But Joey has only had 7. And he's also gotten the longest since his last official outfit in July 2023. Since then, every other Legion member has gotten at least one full outfit to themselves. Now the D&D collection is out, Susie's had 2. I know I'm focusing a lot on cosmetics here, but we don't really have much else left for Joey, especially since what we have from him as a character from non-cosmetic sources does not paint the poor guy in the best light. He's a child of a single mother living in Ormond who can't hold a job down, was fired from his last one for stealing, and has his mixtape add-on description written entirely in slang. Really wonderful job done there with the token black guy in the Legion their behaviour, not an ethnic stereotype in sight. This does mean when the comic was being written, it had a hell of a task in bringing Joey to life in a way that felt intelligent and not exploitative. How do you make a character who is in many ways a walking stereotype into someone with enough substance to centre a whole comic issue around? Fortunately, Nadia Shamas really knocked it out of the park on this one, and as a result, Book 3 is almost certainly my favourite of the 4 issues. It did so much to improve Joey's standing as a character and Legion member, and recontextualised a lot of the more questionable elements of his story. Just like the other books, Book 3 starts with a dream sequence in the mind of its focal character, and Joey sets something apart that gives his entire story a distinctive tone. Joey's dream shows him in the locker rooms at Ormond High, clearly recovering from a basketball game he played with the boys, and barely even alludes to his Legion activities or future as a killer. We see his Legion self briefly killing a man in a corridor, but we're treated far more to sights of Joey witnessing consequences, grisly images of blood and severed body parts still within the trappings of Ormond High, and this sets the benchmark for the rest of Joey's story, and the message it's trying to communicate. Joey is the normalist Legion member. He's the most detached from their antisocial shenanigans, and is the one who is given the least choice in what the Legion would end up becoming, in the life he would end up living. Throughout Book 3, and to a lesser extent the other books, every interaction Joey has with the other Legion members, and especially Frank, showcases how his experience is just incomparable with the others, and how it results in Joey's alienation. From as soon as he wakes up at the start of Book 3, Joey and his mum are clearly struggling. Joey's mum works desperate night shifts at the call centre, and is clearly having difficulties making ends meet, so Joey works to help support her. This is a very far cry from the extremely distant relationship that Frank has with his foster dad, or the amicable relationship that the relatively well-off Kostenko family seems to share. Joey and his mother are close, both because they genuinely care for each other, but also because times are hard enough that they have to be. It's a very normal and loving relationship. Honestly, normal is the best way I can describe Joey's morning routine. Far from the eclectic antics and philosophical back and forths of Frank and Julie, Joey sings in the shower, plays basketball at school, gets a tattoo of the sports team he plays for somewhere his mum won't see it and get mad. It's so wonderfully mundane, it's so teenagery, that you almost forget he's destined to be a killer in the service of an elder domination, and it's going to make what happens later sting so much more. When Joey meets up with Frank, Frank's callousness is highlighted stronger than perhaps anywhere else in the story. Joey doesn't want to order anything from the diner, which makes sense given how money's tight for him and his mum, but Frank goes over his head and orders them both fairly large meals. Unless Frank's paying, it goes to show how Frank just doesn't care about Joey as a person, or think about what he needs. Throughout their meeting at the diner, Frank demonstrates consistently how little he truly cares for Joey. Joey tries to open up to him about the pressure he's under and how his circumstances, be they his race or his class or his family's finances, mean that he isn't afforded the same benefits of the doubt as Frank is, but Frank will hear none of it. He keeps trying to pressure Joey into using his pick of Legion Night activities to do actual vandalism, to do something dangerous, but Joey isn't comfortable with that. Wow, it's almost like Joey's family financially depending on him, so there's actual stakes if he gets in trouble. And his race means he's less likely to be treated leniently compared to the other Legion members. But of course, Frank doesn't see it that way. And he even weaponizes Joey's one-sided crush on Susie to try to push him into action. This leads to my favourite scene in any of the books. When Joey goes into the convenience store he works at with Frank in tow, and the candy bar shoplifting as mentioned at the end of Tome 3 takes place. But it isn't Joey that does it, it's Frank. And without Joey even knowing he's done it. The altercation Joey ends up in as a result becomes no direct fault of Joey's, and he doesn't even understand why the store owner is firing him. From his perspective, the store owner is firing him for no reason, beyond the racial biases he exhibits in their conversation. He's accusing Joey of something that he didn't do, that Joey knows he didn't do, and that makes him understandably upset. Not just that he's being fired for no reason, but that now he won't have the money he needs to help support his family. It weaves in perfectly with how Tome 3 wraps up with the night the Legion attacks that store. Joey rants and raves about how he didn't steal the candy bar he was fired for, and Book 3 shows that he's absolutely right. He didn't steal the candy bar, Frank did, and just kept him in the dark about it because if Frank was honest with him about the fact that he really did steal the candy bar, indirectly getting Joey fired, Joey would be royally pissed at him, and he'd have every right to be. The attack on the store comes from the Legion acting on Joey's righteous indignation at being fired for no reason, but the group, and especially Joey, really should be angry at Frank. This wouldn't have happened if Frank had shown anything other than callous disregard for the well-being of his friend. And of course, when Joey's boss confronts him about the theft, he immediately uses Joey's race as a weapon against him, giving Joey a very legitimate reason to get upset at him in a way that might all be too familiar to many marginalised people forced to work for one of the few employers in a small town. In this way, Joey turns from an exhibition of harmful racist stereotypes into a victim of them. Someone who was pulled one way by a racist and thoughtless employer, and the other way by Frank's callousness, and was never given a real choice in what the Legion became. Despite having by far the most legitimate grievances of any of the Legion members towards the oppressive society that Frank talks about so much, Joey works by far the hardest to remain a functioning part of it, to make the best of himself despite his challenging circumstances. And if Joey were to ever learn of what Frank did, how Frank took that candy bar and tricked him, they might never have attacked that store. The cleaner might never have died, and Joey wouldn't be stuck with the rest of the Legion as a minion of the entity forever, leaving his mum behind, heartbroken and alone. After Frank and Julie's stories mostly retread old ground as they pretty much perfectly match each other's freak, Joey's story is a reminder of the human consequences of a life like that. The people that get hurt along the way and the normal, happy human lives they left behind. If it hadn't been for Frank, Joey could have kept on playing basketball and working at the store and crushing unrequitedly on Susie, all of these normal teenage boy experiences that he was owed and was cruelly denied. All he ever wanted to do was have fun with his friends. But before we finish up, I do want to say thank you, because this channel has not long hit 50,000 subscribers, and it really does mean the world to me. 50k is a hell of a milestone. We're halfway to that play button, and I couldn't have done any of it without you. So whether you're a new viewer or you've been watching since the beginning or anything in between, thank you. It really does mean a lot. And I've got 2 things in the pipeline to celebrate. The first one is a special video that you'll be seeing later on in the month. But first, we're going to be doing a 50k Q&A. So there's a Twitter link and a link to my YouTube community page in the description. And ask me a question, or put it in the comments of this video, whatever. Mark it as for the Q&A. And if it's an interesting one or people have been asking it, I'll put it in the video and I'll try and answer it as best I can. And that'll be the next video, so it'll be in a few days. So if you're watching this video within a couple of days of it coming out, ask a question, I might be able to answer it. So once again, seriously, thank you. It's a job of a lifetime. So yeah, thank you. And here's to the next 50k, eh? Now, should get back to the Legion. Susie's story in book 4 wraps everything up, a full half a year after the release of Joey's book after 2 days to the release date. And after seeing a sliver of Susie and Julie's relationship in the first 2 books, Susie's the one everyone was waiting for. Susie Lavoie is Dead by Daylight's first canon sapphic character. She has an unrequited crush on Julie, and about half of Susie's book is about exploring that relationship and why Susie is drawn to her, and by extension the Legion. And this is revealed in both the dream sequence at the start and in a flashback conversation she has with someone we might recognise, a young Jeff Johansson. We'll talk more about Jeff and his significance later, but it's what Susie says to him that clarifies her relationship with the rest of the group. Unlike Joey, who's mostly around the group so he can just be close with his friends and the girl he likes, Susie's got some issues she needs to let out, and the Legion, especially Julie, provide relief. Susie's dad was implied to be abusive in book 2, but is outright confirmed to be in book 4. And that meshes together with the general stresses of being a cooped-up teenage girl in a small town who can't come clean about her feelings to create a constantly agitated young girl who needs an outlet to reclaim her agency in her life. Susie has to hide her anger in public, around polite company who might judge or punish her for lashing out, but that makes Julie's devil-may-care attitude very attractive for her. She wishes she could strike out like Julie does, and Legion activities gave her the means to do that and get close to Julie at the same time. Maybe Susie always had a violent streak, maybe it was brought about by her circumstances and nurtured by her closeness with Julie, but I think her true nature is shown when Julie's being apprehended by the store cleaner. While the others are still figuring out a plan, Susie tries to talk him down, and is about to remove her mask, incriminating herself and possibly ruining her own life in the interest of protecting Julie, only for Frank to attack him from behind before he sees Susie's face. She doesn't wail on the cleaner in an attempt to save Julie violently. She doesn't do what Frank did, but she was willing to sacrifice her own safety and her own future for Julie in a way that nobody else did. Not even Frank. And Julie, who has taken advantage of Susie's complacency and adoration since the start of the books, repays that kindness in the cruelest of ways. Book 4 features the last major shift between the canon of DBD's existing lore and the comics. In the base lore, Frank is the first to stab the cleaner, then Joey, then Julie, and finally Susie. Her hands literally forced by Frank to finish the job. But in the comics it's a little bit different. Frank still starts it out, but then it's Julie, who stabs the cleaner with none of the hesitation she displayed in the base lore, before immediately pressuring Joey and Susie to follow suit. Not even out of necessity here. Her and Frank have already killed him, but simply as a way to affirm their bond in blood. Joey's hesitant, thinking of how it would hurt his mum, but Frank pressures him into it, leveraging his betrayal at the hands of the store owner to coerce him into sticking the knife in. But what happens to Susie is by far the most interesting change. This time, instead of Frank physically forcing Susie to finish off the cleaner, it's Julie, who carefully places her hands on Susie's, tells her it'll be okay if they just finish the job, and as they drive in the blade together, something starts to coalesce around them. It looks almost like some kind of mist or fog. I'm sure it's nothing. When the 4 of them depart to Mount Ormond Resort to bury the body and plan their escape, Frank hears something out in the woods and steps into a dark fog. Well, this book draws it as pink, which is a weird creative decision, but at least it makes it stand out. Julie and Joey follow him into this encroaching fog, leaving just Susie behind. And this is where it all comes together. Susie's been taken well and truly beyond the brink by Julie and the group. Any semblance of fun is long gone. She doesn't know if she can go any further. But when Julie turns back for her, those long-held feelings, that irrepressible love, somewhere she can wield that rage and someone she can share it with, is what draws Susie into the fog. And thus the entity claims the Legion for its own. Book 4 is a great character piece that caps off the Legion story with its refreshing new take on a fan-favourite Legion member. It covers by far the shortest time span, but also goes into the most depth on its subject character of any of the 4 books. I think Book 3 is still my favourite for how it manages to recontextualise Joey's life and troubles without trampling the existing canon, but Book 4 was definitely worth the wait to see DBD's first canon sapphic character get to spread her wings. Before I wrap up though, I want to talk about a secret 5th thing, a presence that looms over the narrative from the very first panel to the very last. It's the entity, and the wider Dead by Daylight universe it represents through its presence in this book. The Entity, represented by the tentacles and fog we all know and love, is present in some capacity in all 4 of the dream sequences at the start of the books. And there's an argument to be made, I think, that these dream sequences are a kind of manipulation by the Entity itself to push the Legion towards becoming the Legion, but I don't entirely believe that to be true. Even without the dreams at all, the circumstances and attitudes that each member of the Legion showed long before the Entity got involved in their lives were enough to put them on track to become killers. And it would kind of make their character development into killers feel irrelevant if it was all just the Entity's plan all along. And in a lot of cases, visions of the Entity's realm manifest in people's minds in the form of dreams or thoughts or hallucinations, and the Entity is a being that exists beyond space and time. For all we know, the visions of violence and brutality that the Legion members saw were their brains processing the visions of events that were yet to happen. But even aside from the Entity's direct intervention, the world of Dead by Daylight is still painted in and around these characters in a way that reminds us constantly that this game is much bigger than 4 Canadian teenagers who like to run and stab. Jeff, the survivor from the same chapter Legion released in, is a prominent side character appearing in books 2 and 4, with his camaraderie with Frank alluding to his first commissioned work as he painted the Legion mural on the wall of Mount Ormond Resort. Jeff will be getting his own video at some point, but for now he just kind of sits as a mirror to the 4. Like Joey with his basketball and his job at the convenience store, Jeff has his passions of art and music that he enjoys alongside his work at the video store. And unlike the rest of the Legion, he will grow up into a man before being taken by the Entity. There's another couple of really nice touches in the otherwise sparse pages of Book 2. Jeff's video store has a couple of movies in the Cold Wind series starring a very familiar man with a chainsaw that we all might know and love. A Man Named Boy is an allusion to Billy's story in Tome 5 of the same name, and it's a really nice touch that Julie says that he doesn't use his chainsaw in the first film, just like he never uses the saw in the Tome story either. It's a funky little reminder that when it comes to the Entity's realm, what is fiction in one universe can easily be reality in another. And to the members of the Legion, Max Thompson Jr. is as much a fictional character as they are to us. But also in Book 2, Julie tells Frank a story of a supposed mining accident that killed 13 people that she claims was intentional, a form of human sacrifice after horrific working conditions at the mines. My initial thought is that this could be an allusion to the Trapper's Law, given that that ended in an engineered miner collapse, and the mine in the comic panel looks a lot like Suffocation Pit, especially the way that it's shown in Trapper's Tome cinematic. But this probably isn't quite right. The Macmillan estate was explicitly in Seattle, which is about 800 miles away from where Ormond would be, given that it's in Alberta, north of Calgary. But there is something in the art worth noticing. Staring back at you from the panel is this pair of glowing red eyes, drawn exactly the same as Julie's eyes are drawn when she's under the Entity's influence at the end of Book 4. So unless Julie is just chatting shit, there could well be something Entity-related that's been kicking around in Ormond long before the Legion were even born. Julie's talk of cult activities and human sacrifice brings to mind the Black Veil, a group of cultists who worship the Entity as a god and have worked in the shadows for centuries. So if she's right and this comic panel does show something out there in the tunnels, then even after the Legion vanished, there may still be something out there, waiting in the foothills of Mount Ormond. Honestly, who knows? It might even be related to the casting of Frank Stone, because, at the end of the day, we don't know where Cedar Hills is. For all we know, it could be right next door to Ormond. But regardless of whether there really is anything out there in the frozen shithole of Mount Ormond, the sheer presence of the mystery, the allusion to something greater at play in the Entity's cosmic game, thoroughly ensconces the comic series as part of Dead by Daylight's ever-expanding universe, and something of interest even if you're not interested in the Legion as characters. This is why I'm so glad that we got a writer as accomplished as Nadia Shamas for this book. She clearly understands what makes these characters tick as characters, not just as names and masks from a video game, and brought them to life very well in these pages of these books. Granted, they do sag a little bit at the start, we're mostly going back over Frank and Julie's relationship in a way that we've already seen before, that cuts a little bit too close to just rehashing Julie's Legion tome. But when Shamas was given a bit more freedom, filling in the gaps with Joey and Susie because these characters didn't have that focus before, we get to see Shamas at her best, and these characters start to really shine. The only real shame here is unfortunately the character she was given to work with. There's not a huge amount you can really do with a killer like the Legion. A rehash is inevitable, because the time spent between them meeting up and the Entity taking them was comparatively short. We know that story, and aside from putting the spotlight on Joey and Susie, there's not really much else that can be told. And what there is to tell has to work around a minefield of retcons and strange racial stereotyping. I want to see what the dream team of Shamas and Snook could do with another go at writing Dead by Daylight comics, but with characters with a stronger foundation to build off of, who've got more story ready to go, so they can have more freedom with the plot and not risk retreading old ground so much. Maybe a pariah story featuring Elodie and Felix, or a supernatural adventure with Haddie and Jordan, or look into one of the killers who has a more human relationship ripe for exploration like Charlotte and Victor, or even a dearest relationship with her followers and fellow priests. We've seen what Shamas and Snook can do with mediocre stories to build off. I want to see how they can build on Dead by Daylight's finest. And I do hope we see more books from Shamas and Snook, or from other writers, artists and publishing companies, because I'm really glad these books exist. They expand the world of Dead by Daylight in ways the main game never could, and the medium has so much room for exploration should behaviour decide to make more. My brain is just salivating at the idea of a Casting of Frank Stone companion book, or maybe even a manga-style book to tell the story of the Skull Merchant. I mean, I'm the only person who would buy that book rather than burn it, but come on, a man can dream. Dead by Daylight is a vast and expansive universe now, one bristling with characters, ripe with stories to tell, and the Legion comic represents a step in the right direction, which brings me a little bit of hope after a year of generally subpar original storytelling. And with a year almost entirely constituting licensed content on the horizon, it's works like this, the upcoming original tomes, and the imminent arrival of the Casting of Frank Stone that will make or break Dead by Daylight's original storytelling in the year to come.